Welcome everyone to another live stream of CWI Media. We bring this live stream every Tuesday, 3 o'clock UK time. We bring unique perspectives and reports from the ground, from activities and struggle that is taking place across the world. This is unique in many sense that the information that you get here, we will unlikely to get anywhere else, particularly in the bourgeois media. So please do continue to come to this particular live stream, support us, share, particularly also if you are not subscribed to the CWI Media, please do that now immediately if you can. Today we are going to discuss about global crisis in terms of perspective for struggle, etc. Recently, Committee for Workers International had an international meeting of International Executive Committee members. About 70 leading members across the world come together. Of course, it's online this time, at a meeting, discuss various particular development that is taking place across the world. And today we are going to hear from two international secretariat, two comrades from the international secretariat, Saunois and Hannah Sell. First of all, let me bring Hannah. Hannah is also a General Secretary of Socialist Party. Welcome, Hannah. Hannah, can you explain a little bit about what's the situation with the global economy and what's the prospect for economy to recover in the coming period?
Okay, thanks, Senan. There's not time in a short broadcast like this to say everything you would want to say or that we discussed on the global economy, but I think it's clear to everybody capitalism is in a severe crisis. This is worse than 2008. It is the worst crisis since the Great Depression of the 1930s. Just to give you an idea, in 2009, world GDP contracted by 0.1%. This year, it's expected to drop by 6%. So that gives you an idea of how much worse on a global scale the current crisis is. It's a major turning point in world history. When we look back, this pandemic and its consequences will be seen as a point at which everything changed. That's not to suggest that the crisis has been caused by the pandemic. Capitalism is a cyclical system. It always has periodic crises, but it is also an ailing and increasingly sick system with more frequent, deeper crises and weaker recoveries. So we've had the 2008 crisis, and there has not been a healthy recovery from that. Wage restraint has remained the norm in the so-called recovery in most countries of the world, and the underlying problems have remained. Massive debts in the world economy. Last year, the IMF said that a crisis on the level of 2007-2008 would lead to 40% of companies in a number of advanced capitalist countries, including the US and Britain, being faced with bankruptcy, and obviously the result of millions unemployed, mass job losses and so on as a result of that. And as we know, the crisis we faced is much deeper than 2007, 2008. What COVID has done has accelerated and intensified every negative trend that was already there. And so, you don't need loads of statistics, I'm sure you will know them. The fact that in the US, unemployment is over 40 million, higher than it was at the peak of the Great Depression. That in Britain, there are now nearly 3 million unemployed, plus over 7 million who have been furloughed, at least some of whom are clearly going to face unemployment. The Bank of England optimistically say that in Britain, this will be the steepest recession in over 300 years. Whether that's true or not, this is bad, that's clear. It's a very severe crisis. Now, clearly, the capitalist classes of the world have tried to do something about the scale of the crisis, and they have intervened in the world economy on an absolutely gigantic scale. The level of the bailouts, the furlough schemes and their equivalents around the world are bigger than anything, much bigger than anything that was done with the banking bailouts back in 2008. And they have had some limited effects on making the crisis less bad than it would have been otherwise. However, the capitalists will not be able to indefinitely sustain the enormous state debts that have been built up. They can do it in the advanced capitalist countries for a period. They'll have no choice but to do it for a period. But this is not like the time after the end of the Second World War, where effectively they were able to gradually pay off the debts because there was healthy economic growth, the post-war upswing. That is not what we are facing today. And even the richest countries won't be able to handle those debts indefinitely. They can for a period. Of course, it's a very different story in the neo-colonial world. The nightmare that's facing the masses of Lebanon, taking to the streets literally because they're starving at this point in time, and the IMF, of course, negotiating loans with the governments with all kinds of privatisation strings attached that have not yet been handed over, as they always do. That will be the situation for millions of people in the neo-colonial world. But even the major capitalist powers are not going to be able to overcome this crisis. They're all kind of whistling in the wind, hoping it's going to be a V-shaped recession. So yes, it's very deep, but it's going to bounce back up. There was a ludicrous article in the Financial Times, which is the kind of major paper of British capitalism, earlier this week, where they were talking about how good it was that the working class have gone out to the beaches and are crowded buying ice creams because it means the economy will bounce back and everything will be like it was before. Of course, there'll be some bounce back because people will be out and shopping again a bit. But there are really big limits to that. First of all, the virus isn't over, as we all know. Secondly, the lockdown may be easing, but people are not going to be confident, even when they've got the money, to go back to cramming onto beaches in general, and are going to be much more spaced out when they do go out shopping to restaurants and so on, and that limits the ability of those companies to make a profit. Thirdly, people are worried about their futures. So even if they've got money, they're generally not spending it. They're saving it because they don't know what's going to happen. And then finally, and this is of course the biggest factor, there are millions of people who are not going to have any money to spend because they've been thrown on the coals and made unemployed. That's people who've lost their jobs. But it's also small businesses. I saw a statistic about the US. 22% of businesses in the US, 3.3 million, went bust between February and April. And they are mainly the small businesses. They're not major corporations. By the way, that was 41% of black-owned businesses went bust. And that gives you one indication. It's going on to things that will be dealt with later. The Black Lives Matter movement is fueled by anger at vicious police brutality, but also what capitalism means for black workers and even for the black middle class, who are being thrown in many cases back into the ranks of the ranks in the unemployed as a result of the crisis that exists. So what's going to happen? Capitalism won't collapse. It has to be overthrown. It will always, the capitalist class, find a way out of the crisis until we get rid of their system. But how will they find a way out of the crisis? By making us pay, the working class pay, both in terms of mass unemployment, the health consequences of the virus, but also further down the road, trying to make us pay for the bailouts. It's interesting today, the British Prime Minister Johnson has made this big statement, but in it he refused to rule out tax increases for ordinary people further down the road. They don't dare do it now, but they're considering that in the future. We also don't exclude them being forced to take further Keynesian measures, further state intervention, particularly faced with mass movements and massive unpopularity. Again, Johnson today has made this speech where he said, I'm not a communist, but I want a fair deal for people in Britain, and then went on to compare himself to Roosevelt and the New Deal. The enormous state stimulation that took place in the US in the 1930s is empty words in this instance. Actually, the £5 billion he's promised is mostly not new money and is what they've spent in 1 week on the COVID bailout. So this is not the New Deal. It's peanuts. Actually, what he's mainly done is ripping up regulation so that house builders can build with even less rules than before to sell rabbit hutches to people who are not going to be able to afford to buy them. It's going to do nothing for the economic crisis. But they can be forced to take more serious measures in the future, but that will be because of the mass opposition they're facing. Even what he's announced is as a result of him plunging in the polls, the massive Black Lives Matter demonstrations that have taken place in Britain, as in other countries, him feeling the heat. But whatever they do, they are not going to be able to overcome the crisis of capitalism. We are facing a depressionary period where even if there's little bits of growth, it's going to be a long period of misery for the working class, the only way out of which is fighting to transform society.
Thank you, Hannah. It's devastating details in terms of the new period that we have entered, in terms of how things are unfolding. Another important aspect that we discussed is deglobalization. I want to bring in Tony Saunois of the International Secretariat to talk about a little bit of that. Tony, the deglobalization is taking place at the moment. What is it, and what is the consequence of it? But also want to ask you, in addition to that, is the kind of competition that emerged, the trade war between US and China, and also in terms of how we're shaping up the geopolitical situation worldwide. Can you explain a bit more?
Yeah, so thanks, Sinan, because I think that's a fundamental question, obviously against the background of what Hannah has explained in terms of the general economic crisis which is taking place. But this process of deglobalization marks an historic change in the situation. And of course, to understand what we mean by deglobalization, we have to really be clear what happened with the process of globalization. And that took place against the background of the collapse of the former Stalinist states in the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, who reverted back to a capitalist society in 1989, 91, 92. And following that process, you saw an incredible integration of the world economy. There was a pulling together, an integration reflected in all sorts of trade agreements that were established, the NAFTA trade agreements. It facilitated further integration of the European Union. It facilitated the introduction of the euro. We saw the development of a whole series of supply chains established globally, and a general coming together and locking together of the world economy. Now, that took place against the background of a relatively stable economic situation and a certain upswing which was taking place at that particular period of time. Now, some on the left argued, well, that process was going to be unstoppable, that it illustrated the fact that capitalism had overcome the limitations of the nation state. Some even went so far as to put forward the idea that in Europe, for example, we were moving in the direction of having one unified European capitalist class, which is something that the CWI always argued against, because we pointed out that while this process of integration and globalization had taken place, it had gone a long way, in some ways further than even we had anticipated. We always argued it was not going to be a sustainable process. It was inevitably, capitalism was constrained by the limitations of the nation state, and most importantly as well, they will assert themselves to an even greater extent once the economic situation changed and the process goes into reverse. Once there was a serious economic recession or depression, this process of globalization would begin to be reversed, and it would enter a phase really of deglobalization, which we're seeing at this stage. And I think we should make the point, this is not the first time this has happened historically. In the run-up to the First World War, prior to the First World War, rather in 1914, you saw a similar tendency towards a globalization of the world economy. As the situation changed, there was a scramble between the imperialist powers for shrinking markets and to expand their position, and they came into conflict with each other. And you saw, of course, the development up to the point of the First World War, which was obviously a complete collapse of any process of globalization and integration of the world economy that had taken place at that particular point. Now, today, what are we faced with? We're seeing this process is beginning to go into reverse. And the question that you pose, Sinan, the two questions, they are interlinked, because this clash between the US and China is part of this particular process of deglobalization, as each of the capitalist classes in the different countries assert themselves to try and defend their own particular interests. We've seen for a whole period two dominant trends in the global situation. One is the general decline of US imperialism. It's still the most powerful force on the planet, but nevertheless it has been in a relative decline for a whole period. And on the other side, we've seen this incredible ascendancy of China. For example, in 2000, China accounted for 3.5% of global GDP. By 2019, that had increased to 14.5%. And it's led to this continual struggle and friction and developments that have taken place between the US and China, because the US is being compelled, it's partly driven by Trump's desire to be re-elected, but the US has been compelled to take measures to attack China. So the tariff wars have begun to develop. You've seen tariffs imposed. This was even before the pandemic took place. And it's accelerated. And that's part of the process of deglobalization which is taking place. Now, that is unfolding quite rapidly. There is a decoupling taking place between China and the US, with a whole series of restrictions being imposed in a tit-for-tat measure, which is going to have devastating consequences for the economy, for both economies at a certain stage. But they're driven by the sheer logic of the position to this issue of a trade conflict and a trade war. And that is resulting in a tendency towards the beginnings of the emergence of two poles globally. Those who have been drawn around the US, those that have been drawn around China. How far that goes, we have to see. We have the decline of US imperialism, the emergence of China. How far that process continues, that is something that remains to be seen, because China's growth could be cut across, China's development could be substantially cut across or brought to a shuddering halt on the basis of a serious economic or social crisis in the economy. Now, it's leading to all sorts of contradictions, and it's not just going to be a clear-cut process. If you take, for example, the issue of Germany, they're fundamentally dependent on exports. They export a phenomenal amount to China. Volkswagen, I think, exported 4.7 million cars to China in 2017, 2018. So that's a pressure. They're not just going to automatically fall in line and support every measure that Trump has argued for. On the other side, there's a contradictory pressure, because they're looking to expand and have expanded their markets into Eastern Europe, where China wants to come into play as well. And that's going to lead to aggravated conflict there. So we're going to see a process of increased tensions, tariff wars, an escalation of this conflict in the short term. And it's leading to all sorts of geopolitical realignments, regional conflicts and wars being posed as a serious possibility. And it's been played out in a very dramatic way. We've seen recently the conflict between India and China of the Himalayas. India's now taken measures, I think, to ban 50 apps, I think it is, from use from China to be used in India. We've seen other measures develop, and we have the prospect of all sorts of struggles breaking out as there is a struggle for resources and realignment. There was a very important report on Al Jazeera yesterday about the conflict which is currently breaking out between Ethiopia and Egypt over the question of water and the building of a dam in Ethiopia. And we had the prospect of a whole series of conflicts of this character breaking out, in part as a consequence of this process of globalization. And it's going to have brutal consequences for the masses internationally. It's going to have and is having devastating effects, particularly in the US and in the neo-colonial world at this stage. And I think Hannah made a very important point in terms of the bailouts that have been introduced in the to try and offset a complete collapse. I think the figure is about 17 trillion US dollars globally have been put into the different economies as part of the stimulus packages. But that has not been the case in the neo-colonial world. In South Africa, it's devastating. The programme of the budget, as our South African comrades reported at our very successful meeting of the IEC, in South Africa, their budget is for cutbacks, it's for increased taxes, it's for privatisation, and that has generally been the pattern across much of the neo-colonial world in the course of the past period. So it's a whole new era where the power of US imperialism is being challenged, but it's going to be on a very conflictive basis and not in a clear-cut manner. You see, I mentioned Germany earlier. Well, you see the contradictions as our supporters from Japan pointed out that Japan finds itself in. It's very much interlinked and dependent on China, particularly Chinese tourism, on the one side, so they're going to want to try and sustain that. On the other, they're dependent on the US militarily to protect themselves. So we have a whole new era opened up globally as part of this process of deglobalization.
Thanks, Ronnie. Just in addition to that, one more question is that when you talked about the US, there is a massive crisis in the US at the moment. We have seen this BLM, the Black Lives Matter movement, and how it's shaken many institutions to the core. We haven't seen enough how deep it can go, and also, what are the things, what is likely to unfold in the US in the coming period, particularly in relation to the presidential election. Can Trump win the next election?
Well, that's a crucial question, because obviously the developments in the United States are decisive for world events. And the US is in its biggest crisis since the 1930s already. It's an economic catastrophe which is taking place. You have 40 million now officially unemployed, and there was a staggering figure put forward recently, yesterday. I'd seen one of the articles, which pointed out not of those people who sign on to the unemployment register, but in terms of the percentage of the adult population that is actually employed. Only 54% of the adult population are working at this stage. That means 47.2% are not working, and it's staggering. Many of them are not signing on, they don't get money. Of course, that would include some that have their own enough resources not to work as well. So it's not the whole picture, but it's a staggering position which is opened up. And we've seen the position that the percentage of the workforce employed of the adult population has been steadily declining. It's been massively accelerated in the course of the last period. Now, to get back to the same percentage of the workforce of the adult population that's employed that existed pre-2007, 2008, they would have to create 30 million jobs. Now, we have to put that against the context that it took them 10 years to create 22 million jobs after 2007, 2008. And as our friend Nicholas Rubini pointed out, they've managed to lose 30 million jobs in the space of 2 months. It's a catastrophe. And it's that and the massive grinding down of poverty and wage conditions which exist, the queues of millions for food banks which is taking place, where they're queuing for miles. And as Rubini again has pointed out, they are one step away in the US from food riots. You have this explosion, which is an uprising of sections of the population around the Black Lives Matter, and a complete collapse of Trump's support in the opinion polls. He is now trailing in all of the marginal states. All of the pointers are that he's destined to lose the presidential election because of what's happened socially and economically. And we'd have to add, of course, the catastrophe which is unfolding in relation to the virus itself. I mean, it's just horrific what is taking place, the surge which is taking place in all the main states. They're having to go back to lockdown again in Florida, Texas, Arizona, etc. And there's a desperate position opening up. And at the moment, you say Trump is poised to lose the presidential elections. The only factor we should bear in mind on that is the American election system and the steps that Trump may try and take to prevent people voting in a completely undemocratic way. A few days ago, you had a primary election were taking place in the state of Kentucky, and they succeeded in originally normally had 3,700 polling stations in Kentucky. It was a primary election, so in that sense it wasn't so crucial, but normally it's 3,700 polling booths open in the state of Kentucky. That was reduced to 170, and it was largely constant. Those that were shut down were in the poorer areas, the black areas, and it's a voter exclusion policy which has been there. Now, if they try that sort of measure, which is not beyond them, of course, that can have an effect on the outcome of the elections. What the social consequences of that will be, in terms of provoking a mass movement and uprising against the gerrymandering, etc., we have to see. But Trump is also not in a good state in terms of not only his support, but in terms of his morale. There was a report out today of the situation which is opening up, And there's been leaks given to Fox News from leaders of the Republican Party that are speculating that Trump is partially demoralized. And if the opinion polls point for a calamity, then he may withdraw from the race. And that we cannot exclude in terms of the position. Now, so it's an explosive position, the likes of which we've not seen for decades. It's even more explosive than the position that existed in the 1960s with the civil rights movement, because this time you don't just have the mass movement of the black and Hispanic sections of the population, you have the impoverishment, the mass impoverishment of the white working class as well. It's been a unified movement, which has been tremendous. But the key question is, what's the alternative? Trump can be defeated. Biden comes to power. Boring Joe, as Trump describes him. And on that issue, Trump's got a point. But he's got a terrible track record. Even on this police movement, his position has been to support the idea that policemen should shoot in the legs and not in the upper parts of the body to kill. That's the degree of the radicalization of Biden in this position. But he can come to power. There will be a change of some policies, but nevertheless he's got to introduce, and he would not be a pro working class presidency or representative of the Democratic Party. And the key question now is the urgency, as our comrades in the states of the Independent Socialist Group have emphasised, of the crucial need for the movement to unite together, to carry forward a struggle, and there is a crucial need to build a new Workers' Party. Tragically, Sanders and the others on the left abandoned the struggle, betrayed the movement, have been silent in the course of this particular movement, but all of the forces are emerging objectively, which will give the basis for a larger party, and that's what we've got to fight for. And whoever wins the outcome of the US presidential elections, it's going to be an explosive situation, the likes of which we've not seen since the 1930s.
Major crisis since 1930s, food riots, massive unemployment, and various things, and counter-revolution and revolutionary aspects also present in the US with the uprising of the Black Lives Matter movement and various struggles to come. That's a situation in the US, the leading capitalist country in the world. What about Europe? Let me bring in Hannah to kind of point out some aspects that is developed, particularly in Germany. It seems to be that Merkel seems to be in a stable situation. Is that true, first of all? Second, is that like Johnson, for example, having several struggles to maintain his support, facing massive crisis here in Britain as well. What about also this another point that's not been discussed in the mainstream media? It's about the EU and the Brexit and so on and so forth. Can you explain it a bit more, Hannah?
Thanks, Anand. They're very important and interconnected points. No capitalist government in the world is going to escape the anger that exists about the handling of the COVID crisis and the consequences. But that doesn't mean they're all being blamed equally. And our German comrades did report that right now, Merkel is still relatively high in the opinion polls and is seen as relatively competent compared to Johnson, for example, who was high early on, but has now plunged in the opinion polls. It's not surprising because Britain has the highest death rate of the G7 economies. Whereas it's seen as being not as bad in Germany. But our sister organisations were also organisation was also explaining that will not remain the case. In fact, there are already changes taking place. Firstly, the virus isn't over. There are now serious outbreaks, mainly around meatpacking factories and production facilities, where it's overcrowded, low-paid, mainly migrant workers, but that is resulting in new outbreaks, that super exploitation of the virus in Germany. But it's also the economic consequences. It's not as bad as Britain or the US, but unemployment is still going up rapidly in Germany as well. And it is likely to get worse. So there are 7 million workers on furlough in Germany. It's not called furlough in Germany, but they're equivalent to furlough. And that is likely to rise more. Their car industry is very important. Got 800,000 jobs in the car sector, but there's massive overcapacity. And what Tony was talking about previously, about the growth of national and regional tensions, Germany, like all capitalist countries, will suffer in that and is likely to have car plants going to the wall at a certain stage, and before that, job cuts, pay cuts, and so on. So there will be consequences in Germany as well. There's also the question that you raised about the growing tensions within the EU. And this is also related to the process of deglobalization. I mean, the EU itself was a coming together of different national capitalist classes in order to get the biggest possible market to compete against the other major world powers. But they were never able to overcome the fact that they're a gathering together of nation states, different capitalist classes. They never became one European capitalist class. And, you know, some people thought that would happen. We always explained there were limits. They wouldn't be able to do that. And at a certain stage, it would go back in the other direction. The last economic crisis brought the EU to the brink of catastrophe and fracturing, and they just about got away with it. But it is likely that this time is going to be worse. The tensions are huge. Now, because of that, Merkel has backed this recovery fund, agreeing to put large amounts of money in order to try and overcome the growing national tensions. But it's not succeeded in doing that. It hasn't even been agreed yet. That's still got to take place. And even if it is agreed, there is a bun fight taking place about which countries get the most money, whether it's Poland, whether it's Italy. So all the national tensions are being played out even within that. But there were also tensions from the point of view of the single market, because they've ripped up the state aid rules. Everybody's bailed out their own businesses in order to keep capitalism on the road. But of course, Germany, as the strongest power, has been able to do that by far the most effectively. So of, I think it's 2 trillion euros have been spent bailing out businesses. More than half of that has gone to German businesses. They are going to come out of this relatively strengthened compared to Southern Europe. Meanwhile, Italian's banking sector is facing a devastating crisis. And Italy's not Greece. It's the 3rd biggest country in the European Union economically. So the prospect of the Eurozone and even the EU fracturing is really on the cards as the different capitalist classes try and defend their own interests in a situation of crisis. And then, of course, you've got Britain and Brexit, which you referred to. And even in Britain, it's kind of disappeared out of the news. But it has not gone away. The British capitalist class didn't want Brexit. They would rather remain part of the EU and the single market, most of them, as the best means to defend their profits. But the EU referendum was picked up by the working class fundamentally as a cry of rage against the existing order, and so there was a vote for Brexit. Potentially, that could have been led by the left. If, as we did, there had been mass forces arguing for a socialist Brexit on the basis of workers' solidarity across Europe, but opposing all the neoliberal laws of the EU, it could have had a left leadership. That didn't take place, primarily because of the role of the leadership of the Labour left, Jeremy Corbyn and co. And that allowed the nationalists, the Little Englanders, including Boris Johnson, to really lead that, to step into the vacuum, if you like, in that referendum. Now, they've had no choice but to accept that Brexit's happening, the capitalist class, but they want to make it as closely aligned to the EU as possible. And the EU want that as well. But Johnson is not under the control of the capitalist class. He is following his base, which is 100,000 Daily Telegraph readers. That's a very right-wing newspaper in Britain, who are members of the Tory party. That's who he's listening to. And at the moment, he is refusing to extend the talks to try and get a more closely aligned deal. And the prospects of a deal at the end of this year, which is just on WTO terms, at a time when who knows what WTO terms are because of the glowing tensions between the different world blocs around the world, that is looking more and more likely. That will be devastating for British capitalism, added to the COVID crisis, the economic slowdown, but will also be damaging for the EU as a whole. But the EU cannot make too many concessions to Johnson, because if they do, that sends a signal to their countries within the EU that maybe leaving is a good idea and increases their own centrifugal tendencies. So it's a mess from the point of view of the capitalist class. What is absolutely clear, though, is we are going to see big struggles. It was reported by a whole number of our organisations across Europe how workers have flooded into the trade unions during the COVID crisis. And they've done it not because the unions have given a lead, because overwhelmingly, unfortunately, the union leaders have not, but have followed behind their national capitalist governments. But workers can still see they need to be collectively organised to fight back against the misery that they're facing. Of course, what doesn't exist in most countries is a mass political alternative. So alongside fighting to democratise the trade unions for militant union leaderships, the working class also faces the task of getting a mass political voice. But that will come out of the struggles that we're going to see. And the struggles won't wait for those crises, those things to be solved. We can see movements like the Yellow Vest movement, incoherent from below, but determined and angry, taking place in a whole number of countries across Europe. And as part of those, the need for a socialist programme will be posed. I mean, when you get a right-wing Tory Prime Minister in Britain talking about how he's going to help the people of Britain, but he's not a communist, there are going to be millions of people thinking, well, what is this communism? Maybe socialist ideas are a good idea. They're intervening in the state to rescue capitalism. Why can't we do it? To, for example, nationalise the commanding heights of the economy and be able to share out the work without loss of pay, instead of having millions of unemployed. All of those ideas are going to be coming up in the next period and will create opportunities to build mass support for socialist ideas.
Thanks, Hannah. Given the short time, you painted a picture in terms of the crisis and various problems that's opening up in the EU and also in Britain. If this is the case in Europe, I'd like to also bring in Hannah to say a few words on what's the situation in the neo-colonial countries in Asia, Latin America, in Africa. A devastating crisis opened up there. Can you say a few things about it? Also, can you also give us an idea about what's the prospect for class struggle in these countries?
Okay, I mean, I'll be very brief on this because I think we've not really left time to do this gigantically important subject justice. But we did hear from our sister organisations, for the CWI affiliates in South Africa, in India, in Nigeria, in a whole number of other countries, the absolute misery that the working class and the poor masses are already facing. 55% youth unemployment in South Africa, 120 million jobs lost in India, 30 million workers having to migrate back to the countryside just in order to try and get a crust. The collapse of the oil price, meaning in Nigeria and other oil-producing countries, real misery. And the things we've just discussed about the richer countries, the imperialist countries, about the lack of mass parties of the working class, generally that applies times 10 in the neo-colonial world. But we are going to see, let's remember, prior to COVID, prior to this huge economic crisis that's now developing, we were seeing mass movements in the Sudan, in the Lebanon, in Chile, that were bringing together all the different sections of the working class and young people out onto the streets to say no to poverty, no to misery, to fight for their share and a better kind of society. That was taking place before. It's beginning again in a number of countries now, but we can see movements on an even higher level. We would say you cannot rule out, given the scale of the anger of the masses and the weaknesses of the capitalist classes and the ruling elites in these countries, you can see regimes being overthrown by mass movements of the working class and the poor, even moving towards breaking with capitalism. Of course, to consolidate that, even if that takes place, requires a mass party of the working class armed with a clear socialist programme. But such as the anger that exists, we have to be prepared for all kinds of unexpected developments, but of course, collectively together in the CWI, get on with building the forces of Marxism and politically arming the working class so that they are prepared for those mighty events ahead.
Thanks, Hannah. We're running out of time. We were able to bring you some of the points that have been discussed in the International Executive Committee of the CWI. And there are reports will be available on the website socialistworld.net. There are many reports already available, analysis already available. Please go and read them, share them. And then if you do like them, please contact us, see how you can work with us. And if you have not joined, discuss with us about how to join and get active in areas where you are present. And also support our work and particularly support this stream that we bring you every week by subscribing to the YouTube channel and also liking the Facebook page, which is Socialist World CWI. Also, please, you can also see this live stream on Twitter. This is at CWI Socialist. Please also follow us on Twitter and Instagram. You can follow us on Socialist World. And CWI Media also, you can donate. Most importantly, we are improving our technical stuff and various quality of the technical aspect of it. We do need all the support that you can give us in this. Please donate. You can go to patreon.com/CWI and donate towards it. Contact us. You can donate on the website, but also get involved. Follow us every Tuesday. Share it. If you do like these ideas, discuss it. And then contact us to kind of build our strength to face the mayhem or all the difficult situations the working class across the world is going to face in the coming period. Thank you.